Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third installment of our Gaza lecture series. I'm Nader Hashemi. I'm the director of the Al-Walid Center for Christian Muslim Understanding. So as social scientists, we seek to empirically study the world that we inhabit. We examine the origins, manifestations, and trajectories of diverse social, political, and economic phenomena with the goal of illuminating and comprehending real-world problems and controversies that capture our attention and shape the world that we live in. Today, we're very lucky to have a leading expert on the announced topic to help us understand precisely this subject and to approach it in an objective social scientific way. Tareq Baconi is the president of the board of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. He has a PhD from King's College London, and he was a former senior analyst on Israel-Palestine for the International Crisis Group. He's the author of Hamas Contained: The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance, published by Stanford University Press in 2018. And Tareq's writings have appeared in the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and other leading publications of note. Tareq is also the book review editor for the Journal for Palestine Studies. Last November, he published an essay that caught my attention in foreign policy called "What Was Hamas Thinking?" And that led directly to today's event. He will speak for approximately 45 minutes. Then we'll have a question and answer session, both with the people in the room and with those people who are viewing this event online. I also want to announce that tonight at 6 o'clock, Tareq and I will be in conversation over the question of Gaza, Hamas, and what's happening in Israel-Palestine today at 6 p.m. at Busboys and Poets. First come, first serve. If you want to continue the conversation, please join us at that event this evening. So it's a huge honor to have Tareq Baconi with us today on campus. I can't think of anyone who knows this topic better and is more qualified to interpret and understand this dimension of the Israel-Gaza crisis than Tareq Baconi. Please join me in welcoming him to Georgetown University.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And I want to thank the co-hosts of this event, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, and the African Studies Program for hosting me. I know it's very difficult to have sessions on this issue on campuses these days, so I'm glad that this space is being created at the university. This is the first lecture that I've written since October 7th. It's, and as Nader said, the thinking behind the foreign policy piece informed some of this, but I've been thinking beyond the scope of that piece, thinking a lot about Gaza as well in this context. So I'd love feedback and thoughts at the end of this lecture if you have any. So I want to start by reading the opening of the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish's 1973 poem entitled "Silence for the Sake of Gaza." I quote, "She wraps explosives around her waist and blows herself up. It is not a death and not a suicide. It is Gaza's way of declaring she is worthy of life. For 4 years, Gaza's flesh has been torn into shrapnel flying in all directions. It is not magic, and it is not a miracle. It is Gaza's weapon for defending herself and exhausting her enemy." End quote. It's impossible to read these words today, written more than half a century ago, without thinking about Hamas's attack on October 7th of last year and the ensuing genocide that has been unfolding in Gaza since then. But before we get to this current moment, I want to take us back to earlier days, when Gaza existed solely on the periphery of our consciousness. Mostly forgotten in the public sphere, the Gaza Strip on Palestine's southern Mediterranean coast is home to about 2 million Palestinians, the majority of those being refugees who were expelled from their homes with Israel's creation in 1948 and who have not been allowed to return since. Despite being one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, this coastal enclave was remembered when Palestinians were killed in episodes of spectacular violence and then swiftly rendered absent again. Gaza swung between the two extremes of hypervisibility and invisibility. And when visible, Gaza was discussed primarily, and for many almost exclusively, as a humanitarian catastrophe and a wretched reality, one which evokes pity and helplessness. A miserable stretch of land, overpopulated and dirty, drowning in its own shit and decrepit infrastructure, beaten and abused, on the brink of death, yet refusing the dignity of passing, of letting go. There was nothing quite redeeming about this stretch of land except for one thing. In his poem, Derwish expanded his reflections on Gaza. I quote, "Gaza is not the most beautiful of cities. Her coast is not bluer than those of other Arab cities. Her oranges are not the best in the Mediterranean. Gaza is not the richest of cities, and Gaza is not the most polished of cities, or the largest, but she is equivalent to the history of a nation, because she is the most repulsive among us in the eyes of the enemy, the poorest, the most desperate, and the most ferocious, because she is a nightmare," end quote. In being the most repulsive, Gaza, in essence, personifies abjection in our time. Nowhere more so than in the Israeli collective consciousness, where Gaza is a dark place, full of terrorists, of angry hordes, a place where, in the words of a former Minister of Justice, no less, Palestinian mothers give birth to snakes, not babies. The Gaza Strip is a nuisance that persistently clings to Israel, demanding attention, disrupting the lives of Israelis who want nothing more than to enjoy calm, to live behind a manufactured facade of normalcy. There is no calm forthcoming, of course, because deep within, in some shrouded corner of the Israeli national psyche, is a resounding truth that can never be fully banished, even as it remains unspoken. The Gaza Strip is Israel's creation. In its present abject manifestation, Gaza is a colonial construct engineered precisely to enable the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. The Gaza Strip, as we understand it today, emerged from more than a century-long process of land dispossession, territorial consolidation, and demographic engineering. Zionist settler colonial practice throughout Palestine has entailed policies of confinement that separate Palestinians into enclaves that are entirely and maximally surrounded by Israel or Israeli-controlled territory. Palestinian citizens of Israel, who today comprise about 20% of the population, currently own 3.5% of the land, having lost 40 to 60% of their property since 1948. Since then, not a single Palestinian community in Israel has been able to obtain permits for growth or expansion, while more than 1,000 Jewish communities have been established. The result has been the confinement of the Palestinian population in Israel to urban clusters that are entirely surrounded by Jewish communities. This is the norm throughout the land of historic Palestine. In East Jerusalem, processes of urban landscaping have continued apace, with municipal master plans to boost Jewish presence, erode Palestinian life in the city, and build infrastructure that redraws its landscape. In the rest of the West Bank, more than 90% of the Palestinian population lives on less than 18% of the land, disaggregated into silos. In contrast, Israeli settlers control more than 60% of the territory, which is left whole. This kind of demographic and territorial restructuring was also manifest in Gaza, where until 2005, more than 1.8 million Palestinians lived under military rule, confined to slim portions of their territory, while only 8,000 Jewish settlers colonized the most desirable lands in the enclave. The map of Palestinian islands floating in an Israeli sea in the West Bank is well known, but presents only a partial view of reality. It would be more holistic to illustrate how Palestinians have been entirely restricted to urban prisons throughout Palestine, whether Nazareth in the Galilee, Jisr al-Zarqa on Israel's Mediterranean coast, Kufr Aqab in East Jerusalem, Nablus in the West Bank, or the Gaza Strip in the very south. Such a framing presents the reality of the Palestinian people's singular and holistic confrontation with Zionism from the river to the sea. Understood in this light, and thinking back to Derwish's reflection, Gaza ceases to be exceptional in its isolation. To say so is not to minimize the unique challenges that Palestinians in Gaza face, but rather to argue its centrality to the Palestinian experience, to see it as the microcosm of Palestine, what he calls the history of a nation, and the blueprint for Zionist settler colonialism. Even before October 7, Gaza's isolation was the extreme manifestation of how Zionism relates to the Palestinian population it has not killed. Breaking outside of the false partition between Israel and what is called the occupied Palestinian territories, we are able to see the Gazification of Palestinians throughout the land. And this is true beyond Palestine. Gaza is the blueprint of how settler colonies build ostensible democracies, that is, democracies that are rooted in and emerge from apartheid, from racial and demographic engineering, and from colonialism. In this instance, a democracy solely for Jews that presides over a larger population of non-Jews. For Israel, these facts about Gaza cannot be denied, nor can they be acknowledged without the disintegration of an intricately constructed myth. This is what abjection illustrates. To be accommodated, it demands a revolution. In her essay, Powers of Horror, the philosopher Julia Kristeva writes that, I quote, "What is abject is radically excluded and draws me towards the place where meaning collapses. And yet from its place of banishment, the abject does not cease challenging its master. On the edge of non-existence and hallucination is a reality that, if I acknowledge it, annihilates me." End quote. From an Israeli perspective, acknowledging the colonial partitions erected to separate Gaza from Palestine, confronting the internationally mandated right of the millions of Palestinians languishing there and in other refugee camps to return, recognizing the colonial construct that is the Gaza Strip, would break apart the very foundations of Zionist settler colonialism on which the Israeli state is built. This is precisely why Israel has expended so much effort and endless maneuverings attempting to pacify Gaza, not to confront it, but to banish it from view. Even before the state occupied the Strip in 1967, it had already carried out air raids, enabled the creation of collaboration networks, and undertaken military invasions into Gaza, then under Egyptian administration, to extrajudicially execute Palestinians. One gruesome example led by Ariel Sharon, who would later become Israel's prime minister, as he commanded an incursion by Unit 101 into Gaza in 1953. After 1967, Israel's occupying forces oscillated between policies of economic pacification to ones of outright strangulation, until restrictions on movement and goods were put in place in the 1990s after the eruption of the First Intifada. Many today assume that Gaza is under blockade because it is governed by Hamas. But as I've argued in my book, there's a solid case to be made that Hamas is actually the entity that is blockaded because of Gaza. Following Hamas's democratic election victory in 2006 and its takeover of Gaza in 2007, Israeli leaders were presented with a perfect fig leaf with which to justify their isolation policies. Using the rhetoric of terrorism, Israel placed Gaza under hermetic blockade, ignoring the movement's political platform. The blockade was initially intended to be a punitive tactic to force Hamas's capitulation, but it quickly morphed into a structure aimed at containing Hamas and disconnecting the coastal enclave from the rest of Palestine, what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would eventually concede is Israel's separation policy. As part of this, Israel pursued policies of drip-feeding Gaza's economy, controlling the flow of goods and food, down to the caloric value of food items to ensure that Palestinians are maintained just above the level of official starvation, and managing the passage of people in and out like cattle into a pen. During this time, it launched 3 major wars against the Gaza Strip in 2008, 9, 2012, and 2014, taking the total number of taking the total number to 12 wars waged by Israel against Gaza since 1948, not counting the ongoing genocide. Israeli efforts to break Gaza failed. The abject is persistent, ever-present, unerasable. And for colonial thinking and rationale, the construction of a wretched other is central. Gaza exists in its abject reality not only because Israel has failed to eliminate it, but because Israel as a collective sustains it. Even as Israel legally defined Gaza as a, quote, hostile entity, over the course of the past 16 years, Israel empowered Hamas to govern Gaza's population. Hamas was simultaneously an ISIS-like movement and one that the Israeli regime tolerated. Meanwhile, Israel's demonization of Gaza persisted. Unlike Israel, it was a place where members of the LGBTQ+ community are killed, where women are ill-treated, where school kids are taught anti-Semitism and hate, where mothers celebrate the death of their children. This was a dialectic whereby the existence of the Israeli collective as a civilized superior was predicated on the abjection of Palestinians generally and Gaza to a particular extreme. Having been firmly conceptualized as the abject by its oppressors, it is no coincidence that Gaza is also burdened with a corollary of inspiration for those oppressed in terms of Palestinian steadfastness and sumud. From the early days of Israel's creation, Palestinian refugees in Gaza have consistently attempted to return to their homes. From this trip, the leading Fidaiyin were birthed and politicized in the late 1940s. The PLO Executive Committee was formed in 1964. The first Intifada erupted in 1987, and Hamas emerged officially a year later. In popular parlance, Gaza is known as al-Muqawama, the mother of resistance, affirming revolutionary power in the struggle for justice. Gamal Abdel Nasser invited Che Guevara in 1959 and Jawaharlal Nehru in 1960 to visit the Gaza Strip, to showcase the power of this piece of land to mobilize the anti-colonial movements of the global South. And it is from this land that Palestinians mobilized on one of the most sustained protests in their history, with the Great March of Return in 2018. For weeks, going on 2 months, Palestinian civil society converged on the fence area separating Gaza from Palestine, the so-called border, dancing, eating, protesting, demanding a return to their homes, affirming the centrality of this right to the Palestinian struggle for liberation. Before the protests had even started, Israel had deemed them, quote, terror marches, and placed snipers behind dunes, instructing them to shoot with the intention of killing. As Palestinian casualties rose, so did the diversity of protest tactics. Flaming kites were used to destroy fields around Gaza's peripheries. Tires were burned to obstruct the views of snipers. And still, the international community was silent, even after the International Criminal Court issued a report arguing that Israel was committing war crimes. More than 35,000 Palestinians, most of them children, were maimed over the course of many months. Hundreds were killed, including doctors, nurses, and journalists. And yet the marches persisted. For Palestinians, Gaza in this way emerges as a site of creativity, as the manifestation of what an asymmetric struggle committed to justice looks like, as an example of how to face a ruthless adversary, a place for innovation and resistance that piques the imagination of colonized people. What a burden to place on the abject. Already denied, fatigued, humiliated, dismissed, taken to and kept on the brink of death, the abject is then called upon to liberate. Even today, it is Palestinians in Gaza who are being massacred in their thousands. And still we think of how this rupture, soaked in their blood, might guide us to liberation. This is a burden made more immense because it must be said, Zionism is not a standalone ideology. As a settler colonial movement, Zionism emerged alongside other colonial movements and persists today with the continued support of the world's most affluent and powerful settler colony, the United States. Gaza might be immediately confronting Zionism, but understanding its abjection helps us to grapple with the mechanics of oppression and degradation elsewhere. In that sense, while Gaza is a laboratory for the powerful, as scholars such as Helga Tawil Suri, Marwa Fatafta, and Yal Weitzman have argued, who are seeking to subjugate and hone their skills of oppression, it's also the laboratory for emancipation, for resistance, for understanding the dynamics of asymmetric warfare. With this contextual framing, we can now return to what happened on October 7th, a day whose aftershocks we are still living through and consumed by, a reality which I imagine will persist for many years to come. Hamas's surprise offensive, named the Al-Aqsa Flood Operation, was a bloody display of anti-colonial violence. The operation cannot but be seen as a response to Israel's relentless and interminable provocation through land theft, military occupation, blockade, and siege, and the denial of the fundamental right to return to one's homeland for more than 75 years. It was a moment of rupture driven by the abject that, as Kristeva notes, threatens to annihilate. Hamas's attack dealt the most lethal blow to the Israeli military and public since the establishment of the state in 1948. But it is not on the military level that the attack carried with it the threat to annihilate. There's no comparison between Israel and Hamas's military arsenals. Rather, breaking through the very structures of partition behind which Palestinians had been confined, the attack promised to undo the entire myth underpinning the establishment of the state, thereby threatening a central pillar of Zionism, that Israel can offer safety for Jews in Palestine without having to account for the indigenous Palestinians on their lands. The annihilation in this instance is of a regime of supremacy. Gaza is an island, Derwish writes later in his 1973 poem. I quote, "Every time she erupts, and she is always erupting, she lacerates the face of the enemy, breaks up his dreams, and obstructs his contentment with time. As a result, the enemy hates her enough to kill, is afraid enough to commit crimes, and tries to sink her in the sea, in the desert, in blood. Therefore, her friends and relations love her with a feeling of shame that touches on jealousy or even fear sometimes, because Gaza is the savage lesson and radiant model for enemies and friends alike." End quote. After October 7th, Gaza has once again become the savage lesson of how Zionism relates to Palestinians who refuse to be pacified, who dare to challenge the very scaffolding of their oppression, who embrace their agency in ways that challenge the fundamentals of the colonial regime ruling over them. The genocide unfolding in Gaza now is the most truthful expression of Zionist colonization in Palestine. The angry, sadistic need to obliterate everything, not only Palestinian life itself, but all signs of life, all its manners of being, its bakeries and hospitals and morgues and schools and universities and kindergartens. At the time of writing, Israel has killed more than 31,000 Palestinians, the majority of them women and children, to sink Gaza into the sea or into blood, as Derwish writes, to wipe the slate clean and to fulfill the lie at the heart of Zionism, that this is a land without a people, empty for colonization. The speed, hysteria, and force with which Israel has mobilized underscored that Hamas's offensive triggered an existential response, forced Zionism to return to its basic instincts. For within the Israeli regime, there is a seldom spoken acknowledgement that to seriously account for Gaza and the Palestinians, Israel will cease to exist as a Jewish state, in other words, as an apartheid state in Palestine. To deny this, Israel has relied on time, managing rather than resolving this paradox. Hamas's attack has triggered the immediate fear that for the state, time has run out. This is Derwish's point about the adversary's contentment with time. And in response, the regime has at once shown its true essence, executing long-held plans for mass expulsion and killing, while utilizing a narrative campaign of Palestinian dehumanization to justify immense violence. Before the abject annihilates, it will be annihilated. with hate and passion. A sampling of TikTok videos and social media posts from Israeli soldiers and civilians celebrating this destruction makes that desire clear enough. Why will Gaza simply not die? This is not how either Hamas's attack or Israel's genocide are viewed in mainstream media, particularly here in the West. Israel has successfully severed the link between present-day anti-colonial violence and Israel's historic and present-day system of apartheid. With over 2 million Palestinians out of sight behind walls and under siege and blockade, the Israeli government and most of the Israeli public, let alone Western leaders, washed their hands clean of the reality they had created, now confined to invisibility behind walls. This is not the first time that Hamas obstructed Israel's contentment with time, using the occasional rocket fire or protest. In response, Israel had developed mowing the lawn strategies, whereby it relied on disproportionate military power to intermittently undermine Hamas's capabilities. Stuck in this paradox, the Israeli state and Hamas fell into a volatile equilibrium over the past 16 years, often erupting into episodes of spectacular violence in which thousands of Palestinians were killed by the Israeli military. For Israel, this dynamic worked so well that a political strategy for Gaza was never really required. This positioning evokes the Eshkol government's decision not to decide on the fate of the territories after 1967. Like elsewhere across Palestine, Israel relied on managing the occupation rather than addressing its political drivers, maintaining itself as occupying overlord over the various Palestinian pockets governed by entities under its sovereign control. Hamas never fully conceded to this dynamic. While the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank had effectively succumbed, accepting defeat, ideologically undermining Palestinian liberationist politics, Hamas never did. The movement was indeed pacified, as I argue in my book, by the practical weight of governance responsibilities over the Gaza Strip. But it remained ideologically committed to liberation, its finger on the trigger. Its containment in Gaza was, in its long view approach to the struggle, only temporary. For many scholars and analysts, myself included, the military power undergirding Israeli apartheid meant that even without its ideological concession, Hamas could be practically pacified, de facto contained, for a very long time. The structure of the blockade appeared invincible. The Israeli state felt the same. The only goal that it pursued in the past decade and a half was to try to ensure relative calm for its citizens, particularly those residing in the areas surrounding Gaza, even if such calm came at the expense of imprisoning a captive population of millions and maintaining them in near starvation-like conditions. So thoroughly was Gaza erased from the Israeli psyche that protesters marching to protect so-called Israeli democracy in early 2023 overwhelmingly ignored Israeli control over Palestinian life and the attendant deprivation of political rights that sustains the state, effectively deluding themselves into believing that democracy and apartheid were sustainable bedfellows. Thus, Hamas's offensive came as if out of nowhere for most of the Israeli public and supporters of Israel abroad. By breaking out of its prison, the Al-Qassam brigades, Hamas's military wing, revealed the strategic poverty at the heart of the assumption that Palestinians would acquiesce indefinitely to their subjugation. As Mohammed Deif, leader of the brigade, said in his speech accompanying the start of the operation, and I quote, "We have decided to put an end to all of the occupation's crimes. The time is over for them to continue to act without accountability," end quote. Hamas's operation also exhibited again the asymmetric tools at the disposal of the colonized to strategically challenge regimes that are far more developed militarily. But perhaps most importantly, the operation laid to waste the very viability of Israel's partitionist approach. The belief that Palestinians can be siphoned off into Bantustans while the colonizing state continues to enjoy peace and security, and even expand its diplomatic and economic relations in the wider region. Within hours of the Al-Aqsa flood operation, the infrastructure that had been put in place to contain Hamas, and with it to wish away the Palestinians of Gaza, was trampled before our collective and often disbelieving eyes. Hamas fighters converged onto Israeli-controlled territory by sea, air, and ground under the cover of rockets fired from Gaza, breaking through and flying over the fence that Israel has constructed. Within hours, they had entered Israeli towns, killing at least 1,200 Israelis and capturing at least 240 others to use for negotiating the release of thousands of imprisoned Palestinians. The collision between the myth of Israel as a democratic state and its reality as a purveyor of violent apartheid was shocking, bloody, and ultimately irreversible. By shattering the notion that Gaza could be erased from the broader political equation, Hamas left in tatters the illusion that ethnic partition in Palestine is a sustainable replacement to justice, let alone a moral or legal one, despite the immense political, military, social, and economic costs still being expended in sustaining this vision. Now, the collapse of the partitionist framework has presented a paradox. On the one hand, Palestinians have worked to mainstream the understanding that Israel is a settler colonial apartheid state. This grounding has served as the basis for efforts by some to push for the decolonization and the pursuit of a polity rooted in freedom, justice, equality, and self-determination. The political architecture of such a decolonized space is one that many Palestinians believe will be produced through their struggle for liberation, once the central tenets of apartheid are dismantled. But on the other hand, in the absence of a political project that can effectively champion this decolonial struggle, the collapse of the partition framework on October 7 accelerated Israel's commitment to ethnic cleansing. It likewise reinforced the fascist and ethno-tribal belief that in the absence of partition, only Jews can safely exist in colonized Palestine. In other words, the collapse of partitionist possibilities may have laid the groundwork for another Nakba, rather than a decolonial future. This paradox explains in part why some scholars and analysts have described Hamas's move as suicidal, given Israel's reaction, or irresponsible, given the death toll it has led to among Palestinians. Whether or not either of these characterizations is accurate depends on an analysis of what options Hamas really had. There is no doubt that the attack itself was a decisive rupture, one that in retrospect clearly shows the movement had pursued a strategic shift towards confrontation over the course of the past few years, most likely since the Great March of Return in 2018. From a strictly military strategic perspective, Hamas certainly had the option of sustaining the violent equilibrium of the past 16 years indefinitely, to remain constricted within the framework of the blockade. The looming possibility of ethnic cleansing must not be underplayed, and the staggering death toll that civilians in Gaza are experiencing must give everyone pause to reflect on the enormous cost that Hamas's operation initiated, even when the primary responsibility for this violence sits squarely within Israel. Yet, even against the backdrop of Israel's harrowing assault, the question that should be asked is how Hamas would not challenge this structure of domination, given the violence inherent in the status quo prior to this war. The reality before October 7th was lethal for Palestinians. It is a violence that had become normalized and that at its core had the same intention to kill Palestinians en masse. The genocidal violence we're witnessing today is nothing more than the unleashing of a brutality that has informed every encounter between the regime and Palestinians since 1948. Hamas's containment in Gaza was effective while it lasted. Yet, given the movement's commitment to Palestinian liberation and its firm refusal to concede by recognizing the State of Israel, that containment was always likely to be temporary unless serious effort was expended to deal with the political drivers at the core of the Palestinian struggle. With a growing population in Gaza, governance shortfalls that were becoming increasingly acute, the expectation that Hamas or any other movement would not try to overturn that reality, especially as Israeli impunity expanded, was short-sighted. Put this way, it's clear that a rupture in Gaza was all but inevitable. As a site of abjection, Gaza's eruptive power should never have been questioned. And in collectively witnessing the first live-streamed genocide in history, we must all pause and reflect on the power of this strip of land. It is a power so immense, so globe-altering, that it has mobilized not only Israel, but also the world's foremost imperial power into action. Since the first few hours after Hamas's offensive, the administration of US President Joe Biden has only poured fuel on the fire. In his first speech after the attack, the US president described Hamas as pure evil, comparing its offensive to those of ISIS. He also likened October 7 to 9/11 and repeatedly referred to widely discredited claims, such as those of tens of beheaded babies, to stir up Orientalist and Islamophobic tropes in an effort to justify the ferocity of Israel's response. Meanwhile, mainstream Western media and policy spaces have kicked into gear, massaging the soft power of the war machine, putting forward coverage that lacks nuanced and grounded analysis on the unfolding situation. Instead, a consistent pattern of Palestinian dehumanization has been so thoroughly meted out that any effort to utilize these platforms to dismantle or merely call into question Israel's system of domination is met with perplexed reactions and uniform condemnation. In this reading, Hamas acted irrationally. Palestinians in Gaza were disposable to the movement as human shields, and Israel's colonial system as a whole was sustainable and calm before October 7th. These reactions, more than anything, point to Western hypocrisy and anti-Palestinian racism. They also demonstrate that nothing has been learned by way of historical or political lessons. In January, both the International Court of Justice and the California Federal District Court agreed that there were plausible cases of genocide to be brought against Israel and the US, respectively. That same month, President Biden began making statements regarding the two-state solution, joining other officials globally who are reaffirming this policy as a just, pragmatic, and morally upstanding future objective. Against the background of this chorus, an invasion of Rafah looms, and the US continues to veto any UN Security Council resolution for a ceasefire. This dynamic of embracing a vague, meaningless future promise with which to placate Palestinians at the expense of immediate accountability for violence by Israel adequately sums up international engagement with the question of Palestinian liberation. Partitioning the land of historic Palestine is a policy failure that is more than a century old. The concept of partition has long been used by colonial powers to manage the affairs of their colonies, and Palestine is no exception. Like most decisions taken by the great powers, it elides the desires of the colonized subjects. The Balfour Declaration, issued by the British on their colonial subjects in 1917, called for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, stressing that this should not prejudice the lives of the non-Jewish inhabitants. To the architects of the British Mandate, Palestinians were simply defined in terms of what they were not. They were not the Jewish inhabitants. They had no collective political identity. 2 decades later, partition was institutionalized at the UN with the passage of the 1947 Partition Plan, which called for partitioning Palestine into 2 independent states, one Palestinian Arab and the other Jewish. The UN then had 56 states compared to the 193 current members. Only 33 states voted for partition. Palestinians firmly rejected the partition of their homeland, understanding it precisely as a colonial tool. The PLO, in line with other contemporary anti-colonial movements, forcefully refused the proposal of 2 states when it was established, seeking instead a secular democratic state for all of Palestine's inhabitants. It failed. As the world moved on from the throes of anti-colonial struggles, the PLO's platform became anachronistic. Israel emerged as a colonial state in a supposedly post-colonial world. Partially as a response to this shifting global order, by the 80s, the PLO recognized the State of Israel and eventually announced the independence of the State of Palestine in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, with East Jerusalem as its capital, conceding 78% of historic Palestine. Many Palestinians, as well as allies such as the Anti-Apartheid African National Congress, the ANC, counseled the PLO against the concession, arguing that partition legitimates Zionist colonization and enables the continuation of its apartheid policies. But at the time, PLO leader Yasser Arafat believed that accepting partition offered a strategic victory. And many Palestinians who had been ground down by the colonial machinery of the Israeli state conceded a retreat, accepting partition as a pragmatic way to achieve separateness from Israeli settlers. Despite this unprecedented concession, there has never been an Israeli recognition of the Palestinian right to self-determination in a sovereign, territorially contiguous state in historic Palestine. And there has only been one instance of Israel pulling back settlements from the occupied territory, ostensibly a prerequisite for a Palestinian state, and that is Prime Minister Sharon's disengagement from the Gaza Strip in 2005. But rather than being a precursor to withdrawal in service of partition, Sharon's disengagement allowed Israel to place the peace process on formaldehyde. As his lead advisor, Dov Weisglass, explains, partition, in other words, was a means of reinforcing Palestinian subjugation and of sustaining the status quo. As this regime fortified its control over Palestine from the river to the sea, peace negotiations ebbed and flowed. Throughout the course of an interminable peace process launched in the mid-90s under the guise of the two-state solution, incredible contortions were exerted to try to fit the reality of a borderless, expansionist apartheid regime into this policy prescription. It would take 3 decades to clarify beyond any doubt that the promise of partition that the PLO bought into is the end goal in itself, proving that rather than the pragmatic choice, the choice of partition is nothing but the continuation of Zionist colonization by other means. Today, Palestinians are facing a genocide and the threat of mass expulsion, which dwarfs what happened in 1948. At a moment of rupture that offers incontrovertible proof that policies to date have failed in horrific ways, too many onlookers seek to resurrect those same policies which got us here. Netanyahu and his ilk, meanwhile, cut through the fog and oppose any talk of statehood. As he said in a recent interview, I quote, "Israel must have security control over the entire territory west of the Jordan River." That collides with the idea of sovereignty. What can we do? End quote. On cue, policymakers return to contortions that will wedge the reality of Israeli apartheid into illusions of partition they can still hold on to. They offer that the Palestinian state has to be demilitarized. Israel will maintain security oversight. Not every state in the world has the same level of sovereignty. Illegitimate Palestinian leaders, meanwhile, who remain committed to the illusion of partition, jump on board. The result is like watching a century of failure, culminating in the train wreck of the peace process, replay itself, this time with dizzying acceleration. Which brings us back to Gaza. While international and Palestinian actors will try to return to a model of partition, a more civilized form of apartheid than the blockade offered, the reality in Gaza affirms that ultimately there will be no partition. There will be either defeat or justice. Before October 7th, Palestinians in Gaza joked morbidly about their welcoming of a quick death from an F-16 spewing fire over the slow suffocation of the blockade. They understood that the strangulation they live in and day out, is the intended purpose, not the ultimate death. For the very unsustainability of Gaza, highlighted intermittently as if some urgent endpoint needed to be avoided, was precisely what sustained it, until it didn't. This is the lesson that Gaza has taught us, that the revolution of the abject is inevitable, And this is a lesson that is frightening to those committed to dominance. Countries that proclaim Western civilizational values at home allied the unwanted populations they have brutalized in pursuit of their superiority. There is a Gaza, an unwanted and dominated population, undergirding most sites of democratic rule, built as they are on the legacies of slavery, racialized capital, and colonialism, which is why the truth that Gaza embodies has the potential to dismantle our world order. The violence being unleashed in Gaza today is tearing the world at the seams, with every institution, every country bracing against the shockwaves of Israel's assault. Here in the US, unprecedented popular mobilization is spilling out into the streets along generational and color lines, while the Biden administration pursues policies that are starkly out of sync with the Democratic Party's base. Mainstream newspapers like the New York Times are unabashedly hewing to a Zionist line, undermining their own claims to fair journalism, while TV stations like MSNBC react to October 7th by taking their Muslim anchors off air. Overnight, claims of a commitment to free speech and other democratic principles are rendered subservient to the ideological commitment to Israel, and by extension to Western hegemony. I need not speak to people here about the impact this is having on university life. This model is repeating itself throughout the West, sharply elucidating the hypocritical stance of powerful states to international governance that were revealed after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, the post-war institutions of global governance, the UN, the ICJ, the ICC, international trade, are quickly becoming battlefields for a global restructuring as countries such as South Africa reclaim power and centrality by challenging Western dominance over these institutions, as well as American unipolarity. Palestine generally, and Gaza specifically, is emerging as the epicenter of our world struggle to move beyond its legacy of colonialism and Western imperialism. It is through Gaza that what the Francophone Martinique poet, author, and politician Aimé Césaire described as the colonial boomerang is ricocheting back to the metropole. It is not simply a matter of policy that the US is actively enabling genocide in Gaza. It is a matter of ideological and strategic commitment to Western hegemony. The structure of Gaza is intimately familiar to marginalized people and communities elsewhere. It is known on an intrinsic level, understood even under the layers of misrepresentation imposed on it by dominant narratives. That truth, if harnessed, has transformative potential. What could be seen as a Palestinian war of liberation, rooted in a specific historical and political context, is acting as a lightning rod of radical empathy that can encompass other struggles. This most confined of locales is acting as an anchor to a wider network of liberation and resistance, of fundamental emancipation, of radical humanism across the globe. A true confrontation with Gaza's abjection threatens not only to undo systems of partition and domination in Palestine, but far beyond. For the bloodshed in Gaza to not be in vain, we must appreciate that the fate of this strip of land will not offer deliverance on its own. Gaza has done enough. In the genocidal violence against its inhabitants, we are now painfully witnessing just how costly the struggle for justice is, for all Palestinians and for our collective emancipation. Let me close with words from Darwish. I quote, "It would be unfair to Gaza to glorify her because our fascination will make us wait for her. But Gaza will not come to us. Gaza will not liberate us. Gaza does not have horses or jet fighters or magic wands or offices in capitals. Gaza frees herself of our attributes, our language, and of her conquerors all at once. And when we run into her, once upon a dream, she may not recognize us because she was born of fire while we were born of waiting and crying over our homes." End quote.
Thank you so much for taking a topic that is presented in the mainstream here in the United States from a particular perspective, flipping it on its head and giving us a perspective of how it's viewed by many people in Palestine, in the global South. And as you said at the end of your talk, also how many why marginalized and oppressed peoples also have rallied around the cause of Gaza to identify their own pain through what we've been seeing since October the 7th. So the floor is open. We'll take some questions first in the room and then online. And the first hand that I saw was Al-Sayed Khan. Go ahead.
So, thank you so much for a stimulating presentation and your original work on Hamas. I've been following this with great interest. Asking what was Hamas thinking suggests that we are able to decipher intention, something that scholars in IR really heavily debate. I guess my question is, what is the approach you employ to measuring and operationalizing Hamas's intentions? And I would add another concept, motivations. And the second part of my question is Hamas here, we take Hamas as an entity as the end of analysis, and therefore we study the decision-making / taking process, or you focus on certain individuals, and therefore you study the cognitive map model for the thanks.
Thank you for the question. So in terms of Hamas's intentions and motivations, I have to say that I haven't engaged with the movement or its leaders since October 7th. So this is based on my historical reading and engagement with Hamas's thinking as part of my doctorate project and as part of my book. And in that approach, my methods were twofold. One was to interview. So I interviewed Hamas's leaders, both in historic Palestine and in the diaspora. But I also went through Hamas's archives, both private and public. So all of Hamas's publications and its documentation over a course of 30 years, from 1987 to 2017, I analyzed those using a discourse analysis approach. So understanding their use of language and how they employ certain terms and for what political and strategic goals certain terms are employed. I've given that work, which took about a decade, I've tried to interpret Hamas's thinking and intentions in October 7th. And looked at the publications that the movement has put out and the statements that its officials have done. Now, this relates to your second question, which is understanding how Hamas, how it operates as a unit. Hamas is a very complex organization, and it's multifaceted. And there's every reason to believe that in this specific context, the leaders on the outside didn't really know what was being planned on the inside and how this operation would unfold. And that's actually similar to how Hamas has operated, at least since the late 90s, in which the military wing has had its own some kind of autonomy under an overall strategic direction that is shaped by the political bureau of the movement. And so there's a lot of rifts within the movement, sort of inside, outside, political, military, inside prison, outside of prison. And sometimes those rifts are used to suggest that there's a lot of disagreements between Hamas, or that between Hamas members, or that the movement is showing tensions. And that's true. Often there are tensions. But the movement is also actually quite democratic and has always approached this using a consultative approach. So there's an internal debate. And once a decision is taken, usually, even if there are disagreements, different members would abide by the overall structure of the movement. So understanding how that structure is built and how the movement and its members relate to decision-making is something that came out of my research and of my work. I have to say now, though, that after October 7th, and given what's been happening over the past few months, I have no doubt that Hamas's structure will evolve and will change to react and respond to this.
Okay, before we get to the next question, whoever phone that is that's ringing, could you please shut it off? Thank you. Is that your phone? Thank you. We'll take a question here at the front, and then we'll go at the back again, and then we'll go online. Nigar.
Just a follow, thank you so much for the presentation. Just a follow-up maybe to that. Do you think the operation, and this ties into sort of the smears, the media apparatus, and the narrative that Israel tries to put out as far as this is a Daesh, ISIS-like, terrorist organization, look, they're after our women, they're after our babies, they're this and that, and then, amplified by all the way up to the US president. Do you think the operation was meant to be exactly as it was executed, or was this kind of an operation that went beyond or kind of wrong? The attack on the music festival, the violent, killing or taking of civilians, children, babies. It isn't. Again, going back to the question, what was Hamas thinking? It isn't really helpful for those who are trying to defend the cause. This is a liberation, or it seems like the operation turned more into a lashing out. And I want to put this against sort of how we see these other members of the acts of resistance, however you want to call it, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the militia in Iraq, seem to be launching very different methods. Hezbollah is very careful to prevent civilian casualties in Israel. The Houthis are very, specific about what kind of ships they attack and things like that. So just trying to understand if the operation was meant to be on October 7th as it unfolded or not.
So obviously there's a fog of war that's very difficult to dispel and to try to do the kind of forensic investigation that's needed. But I'll say a few things about October 7th. From my reading of it, Hamas's military operation was initially targeted at military bases. So the military bases around the Gaza Strip, with the intention of gathering intelligence, of pushing back against the blockade, and of taking hostages back into the Gaza Strip. Now,
Military hostages.
yes. Now, under any kind of planning for that operation, the assumption, and it's a very solid assumption, is that Israeli defense would kick in immediately. And so there's a limited time to gather whatever it needed to gather. That's not what happened. And Israeli defenses failed spectacularly for a very long period of time, which led to two things. One, Hamas losing control of that specific operation, and allowing or being in a situation where its fighters were then in populations, in civilian populations for extended period of time without a clear guidance about what to do in that kind of environment, because that wasn't something that was a scenario that was considered. But it also meant that it wasn't just Hamas, that there were other factions and other Palestinians who are not fighters and who are not trained being inside that territory for extended period of time. So it's clear that massacres happened, and there are war crimes committed that had been committed on October 7th against Israeli civilians. It's unclear, and I think veering more towards the no, that Hamas knew that there was a music festival around the Gaza Strip at the time. Having said all of that, the war crimes that were committed on October 7th were different in the sense that they were within community centers and civilian centers of Israelis, but Hamas has committed war crimes in the past. Suicide bombings are also brutal, and Hamas has not shied away in the past from using armed resistance as a form of weapon. Now, the problem in this instance is not just the focus on the war crimes, which obviously Israel also consistently carries out against Palestinians with no retribution. The problem is that the war crimes that happened were then turned into the most brutal, sensationalist forms of violence, beheading babies, the use of rape as a systematic weapon of war, in using tropes that have been debunked repeatedly since October 7th, but that continue to be used by politicians. That is looking at Hamas in an ISIS-like way is a form of enabling the genocide that's happening. Now, I just want to say one other thing here. In all instances of anti-colonial struggle, there is bloody violence that happens. And the question that we need to engage with is morally and ethically, we have to understand what are the structures of dehumanization that allow that violence to happen. So when you say lashing out, of course there's lashing out. How can we not expect Palestinians who have been imprisoned for so long, denied every right, walking into a civilian center where life exists, quote unquote, as normal, to not lash out? We have to understand the structures of oppression that allow that dehumanization to take root. And this is why colonial structures and apartheid regimes are violent regimes, because they enable that kind of violence to happen.
Abraham, and then Fida, and then we'll go to the back of the room. Yeah, Abraham, go ahead.
Abraham Stella. I'm one of the researchers of Hamas for many years. And I was shocked, surprised, not by what Hamas did in terms of atrocities, but in terms of the parameters of the operation. My first question was, how Hamas, a social movement, which for decades used to propagate its concern for society and welfare and the needy and so on and so forth, turned into an organization which is pretty much like the Islamic Jihad, with no concern for society, and going for such atrocities that people who spent 20 and 24 years in jail in Israel should have known and understand what it would lead to in terms of the Israeli response. Now, I came here to hear if you have any new idea about what Hamas thought. And I didn't hear anything except for your interpretation within the context of anti-colonial, decolonial, secular colonial, and all kinds of things that I wonder whether Mohammed Deif or Yahya Sinwar even come close to think in these terms. So eventually, what made it logic or reasonable for Hamas leadership to go for such an operation, which, by the way, if you listen a little bit more to the evidence found on the bodies of the Hamas members who invaded the Israeli territory, you would understand that they meant to stay for days and conquer a specific area, which might have been part of their demonstration. But even if Hamas could think about 50% of success, it would be enough to understand that Israel would not let it happen less than decimating Hamas, simply. So my question is, you said that you mentioned the interpretation of this operation as suicidal. So tell me, please, apart from this ideological discussion of anti-colonialism and so forth, and the really unneeded use of these jargonic terminology, to tell us in more specific and simple words, what did Hamas think would happen after that operation?
I actually really enjoyed reading your book. I actually really enjoyed reading your book. I thought it was very well done.
I know you did.
Anyone who writes a book on Hamas gets extra time during the Q&A session to pose a question like you did. So that's why I let Abraham to continue. But the question still is on the table.
Yes, and I'm sorry I wasted your lunch hour. You should have maybe gone and had a lunch elsewhere if you didn't learn anything. So there's a couple of things that I would say in response to that. First of all, Hamas knew, I cannot see how Hamas would not have known that any kind of significant blow to the structure of the blockade would be met with disproportionate force and violence. So back to Nigar's question before, even if the operation had only been within the narrow confines of hitting military bases, the impact of that on Palestinian civilians would have been extreme. And obviously Hamas knew that. There's
How
no...
do you know that? You said you don't know anything about what they were thinking at that time. You only interpret post factum.
I know that because Hamas leaders are not stupid, and neither are you, and neither am I. And neither is anyone sitting in Gaza who's thinking if there's a significant military blow against Israel, Israel will respond with force. No one in their right mind would think that any kind of successful operation against the Israeli regime would not be met with force. Palestinians have learned that Israel engages in building forms of deterrence to prevent exactly that kind of operation. So Hamas knew that any operation that it carried out against Israel successfully, as it has over the past 16 years, would be met with disproportionate force.
To that extent?
To this extent, maybe not. And this is where their operation ended up going out of hand. I think that the way that the operation took place on October 7th is not what Hamas had anticipated. And therefore, the response is also not what Hamas has anticipated. Now, I want to answer your point about anti-colonial discourse and ideology. You might think this is fanciful discourse. You're sitting in a university. Our point is to try to inject intellectual work in understanding these movements and thinking about how they think. For you to say that someone like Mohammed Deif or other leaders do not think of this in anti-colonial forms or using this language is really quite condescending and patronizing. They do talk about it in anti-colonial ways. They do understand their struggle in anti-colonial terms, just like the PLO did before. The fact that you reject that discourse means that you're failing to understand the colonial structure under which Hamas is operating. They might not use Julia Kristeva, and philosophers that I have quoted here to talk about what we're talking about. Darwish wrote this poem in 1973. Before Hamas was created, talking about anti-colonialism and decolonization and the Palestinian struggle in a global context, pushing back against settler colonies. The idea that Hamas does not have access to this thinking or does not think in these ways is actually quite racist.
For that.
Thank you very much, Tareq. This was a very engaging talk, and I appreciated the historization, and I want to pick up on this question of what Gaza and what's happening, what Gaza has taught us in the past, and what Gaza and Palestinians teach. And I think kind of picking up on the point that you just made, right? It's very hard to kind of try to imagine better futures in the current context, right? At the same time, Palestinians like yourself have been pushing us, right, to think about this, to think about what Gaza is teaching us all at this moment and what Palestinians are teaching us all. And you sort of talked about that the outcome of this may be total defeat or it might be justice. And you said that Gaza has taught us that the revolution of the abject is inevitable, right? And then you talked a little bit about kind of like the battlefront, like the ICJ, the ICC, the ways in which this is kind of becoming a battle amongst kind of marginalized groups, right? And then what's happening in Gaza can both show us how dispensable the powerless and the marginalized are, but also what the possibilities of liberation are. So I guess I'm asking a kind of practical question, because I keep hearing optimism and despair at the same time from many people, is a bit more about this optimism, right? And we see, I know South Africa, what South Africa did kind of was very encouraging for many, just to think about kind of the power with which South Africa undertook that case in the ICJ. But I'm wondering what other nodes you see of kind of possibility and optimism right now. I mean, we see the protests, we see the global solidarity, we see But what other kind of nodes of mobilization are there? Because you talked about the need to kind of harness this.
Yes.
Yeah, and if you have any thoughts about.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I have to say that I personally also fluctuate between optimism and despair. I think that there is a moment of reading this rupture as one that is very productive, but also obviously given the genocide, the victory is not inevitable. It could very much be another Nakba and a loss on a generational level for Palestinians. I think for me, the optimism, so I'm going to talk about the optimism very specifically in terms of the moment of rupture and then think about the bigger sites. Very specifically, the optimism is that there's a regime and a system that had become ossified, expecting the Israeli regime to maintain its dominance indefinitely, managing rather than resolving the conflict. That has really been shaken. So whereas before we were in a pretty predictable trajectory, now there's what scholars might call a punctuated disequilibrium. The equilibrium we were in has now fallen, and any number of things that can happen. And that's always a site of creativity and dynamism. And what comes out of this is yet unknown. So that's sort of the core of my optimism. But to give specifics in terms of where that might come from, I think there's a couple. So the first, and obviously the fact that this happened after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we saw how the Western world responded to that, has meant that that global contestation offered openings that might not have been there before. But the first is on the matter of international governance. So looking at the UN, looking at the ICJ, there is a realignment that's happening, that's been happening for some time. Like if we think of BRICS expanding their membership, that kind of formalization and institutionalization of power in the global South to push back against Western hegemony is now getting greater support and is being accelerated by what's happening in Gaza. So there's a realignment that's happening on the level of international governance in that space, and that's law, it's diplomacy, it's trade, it's all of these measures. So that's one. But the second is actually generationally. The fact that the mobilization for Gaza has broken on color lines, has broken on generational lines, shows that there's a kind of ability to push back against preconceived notions or wisdoms that is very, very powerful. And you see that now in the US specifically, the Democratic Party, the Democrats are completely misaligned with their base. 5 years ago, if you asked me, would anything on Palestine possibly result in a loss of an election for a party in the US, I would have said no way. And now this is something that's very possible. It's on the table, and so that will force a realignment in politics domestically here in the US. So now we're actively talking about ending military support to Israel, right? Like these are openings that didn't exist before, and that exist among communities like BLM, so the African American community, but also among the Jewish community, and the sort of the shift towards anti-Zionism and the sort of their ability to mobilize on the grassroots level in the way that they have. And then finally, just in terms of Palestinians, I think there's been an ossification of the Palestinian political structure. And what I'm seeing on my day-to-day is a kind of thinking and engagement with through the Palestinian communities politically on a level I hadn't seen before, in terms of organizing, in terms of thinking about what a unified liberationist leadership looks like. And that kind of mobilization, again, it's not inevitable that it would lead to victory, but it's not what was before. Before it was clear defeat. Now it's defeat, maybe, right? And so that's a kind of mobilization that's really optimistic, actually.
Geraldine, could you read us at least one question from the online audience, and then we'll go to the room.
Okay, so one question from the audience is, could the speaker explain or address the claim that Hamas does not or did not in their action represent the will of the Palestinian people?
Well, so Hamas first of all, what Palestinian people are we talking about? The only Palestinians who voted in the elections that resulted in Hamas's victory in 2006 are the Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. So the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, that's not the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people obviously include Palestinian citizens of Israel and the Palestinian refugees, and they haven't voted in any political system to produce a legitimate leadership. So there is no legitimate or representative leadership right now for the Palestinian people, and Hamas is in that way an illegitimate party in the sense that it doesn't speak on behalf of all of the Palestinian people. But compared to the other factions in the OPT, it is somewhat more legitimate because it won elections in 2006, which is the last election. So I don't think anyone can claim that Hamas spoke on behalf of all the Palestinian people, and I think that would be a reductionist of what the Palestinian people are. But at the same time, we cannot deny that Hamas is a constituent part of the Palestinian political ecosystem, militarily and politically and socially and economically. And it is a constituent element of, it's one of the main factions, if not the only organized and militarily capable faction among the Palestinian struggle. So it obviously does have a constituency and a following. Yeah.
Okay, there's a question at the very back. Yeah, sir, go ahead.
Thank you so much for being here, and I appreciate the discourse. You had said that what was Hamas thinking? I came here, I wanted to actually go with it. What were they thinking on October 7th? And operationally, you had said that they initially had a command of doing it militarily. There was the fog of war. They did not meet with resistance, and then within the fog of war, they just started shooting civilians, and that's what happened. You did say that war crimes were committed. Are those war crimes being internally investigated within Hamas as we speak?
I don't know. I don't have access to Hamas internally. And as I said, I haven't spoken to them, to their leaders in a long time, since my book has come out. And I'm basing this information on my past research and a reading of all the investigations that have come out since October 7th. In the past, Hamas has taken questions around the committing of war crimes, so for example, suicide bombings, quite seriously, and there would be debate within the movement, both on the strategic use of that form of armed resistance and on its moral implications. And I imagine the same is happening now. The movement has publicly stated that they have pushed back against some of the accusations, particularly the use of systematic rape. So they've pushed back against that. But I don't know if there has been any investigation internally within the movement. They've indicated that if there wasn't a proper investigation to happen within the ICC or within the ICJ, that they would cooperate, but that's not being tested.
We have about 10 minutes left. I want to get to as many questions as possible. 1, 2, 3, and then we'll see how far we go. So go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I'm following what's happening in Gaza every day. It's tragic. I see as well many parts of the Israeli society here in the United States and abroad also see what's happening with horror. And there are, I'm trying to follow as much as I can, different groups that are getting together between Israelis and Palestinians in the understanding that this is a never-ending cycle of violence, fed by extreme violence, in episodes like October 7, in episodes like what Israel is doing in Gaza. And that at some point it needs to end, and it will only end when both parts decide to end the aggression against the other. And I don't think we're anywhere near that, right? But how do you see that nascent, well, I don't know if it's nascent, I'm sure, and I know there were pre-October 7 engagement between Israelis and Palestinians in the Middle East and also here. Obviously, with what's happening post-October 7, those have been even more invigorated, and I see more and more of that. How do you see that as in the prospect of peace building, not obviously now, but in the coming future? Because definitely one of the things that's in my mind is, can we actually all at some point I would like to see this in my lifetime, and I'm sure everyone in this room as well, just see that Palestinian liberation and both nations living next to each other with peace and security.
Yeah, so how do we break the cycle? It goes back to what you said in your talk about it's either defeat or justice.
Yeah.
What does justice look like?
Well, I mean, obviously it depends on who you're talking to. I think just to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian engagement. So in the past, a lot of this engagement enabled a way to paper over the structural realities. So the assumption is that if Israelis and Palestinians can sit together in a classroom and talk, or have a political process and talk, and they get along, then why can't they live together in peace? And there's a fundamental reason why that can't happen, which is that there's a power imbalance between Israelis and Palestinians. Israelis have power and are the dominant party, and Palestinians are the subjugated party. So there can be no coexistence or engagement between Israelis and Palestinians without acknowledging that as a starting point, that there's one oppressor and one oppressed. They're not equal parties. And so in that sense, all forms of coexistence or engagement has become really problematic for Palestinians because it was used as a way of papering over the injustice, right? It becomes all the focus is on peace building, the focus is in coexistence, and no one's actually dealing with the material reality of oppression, which is occupation and apartheid. And so Palestinians now refuse to normalize. They call that normalizing because you're normalizing the occupation in order to assume there's coexistence. And that's not something that's acceptable. So I think the only way that there can be an Israeli-Palestinian engagement that's fair and just is with Israelis who are committed to Palestinian liberation, who understand that there has to be full Palestinian liberation in Palestine. For me personally, what that means is a decolonized space, that Israelis and Palestinians can live together as long as there isn't supremacy, as long as Jews don't get more rights than Palestinians in that space. If we're able to get to that space, then there will be peace and justice. Outside of that space, there's just never going to be justice. So without justice, there won't be peace.
Yeah. Let's take an online question, and then we'll go to the young man who had his hand raised and identified. You'll be next. Go ahead, Geraldine.
Okay. Do you think that Hamas was surprised by the scale and scope of the response by Israeli forces?
Yes, I do. I do think they were. Because I think everyone has been, and I'll say this for two reasons. The one is because one would assume, or let me rephrase, I would assume that something like an operation of the scale of what had happened on October 7th might bring more support for Hamas from beyond the Gaza Strip, either from Hezbollah or from mobilization inside the West Bank or regional powers. And none of that has happened. And so Hamas has become essentially more isolated in the face of Israeli force and in the face of Israeli violence, which has enabled that violence to expand quite exponentially. So in that sense, I think Hamas was probably surprised by it. But B, because as I said before, I don't think that Hamas's operation on October 7th was necessarily as expansive as it ended up being, at least conceptually. And so I do think that but this is, again, my own reading. I have no way of proving that at the moment. I would say, though, that Hamas has clearly developed a huge capability in terms of its defensive infrastructure. And that continues to be quite powerful. I mean, on the battlefield, Israel has largely failed to achieve any of its military objectives. So militarily, and putting aside the question of civilians and the violence against Palestinians in Gaza, Hamas has actually managed to maintain a very solid position, which means that it has at least anticipated some level of Israeli violence on this scale.
Young man, go ahead. Did you have your hand up? Oh, you had your hand, sorry. Yeah, wrong person.
Well, you suggested or you discussed during the talk about 2018 and kind of its importance in reshaping the paradigm, at least about Hamas's end, and perhaps helping to propel and start the thought process in Hamas about conducting an operation, something like this. Could you elaborate about what happened between 2018 and October 7th? Were there any major developments in terms of Hamas outside of obviously the conflicts that were occurring in between? Could you just elaborate?
Yeah, that's a great question. So on 2018, I think that a few tactics were used in 2018 that we now, or I now think, began the process of Hamas thinking in terms of more of an offensive capability, including how to disarm some of the defensive capabilities around the fence area. But the main milestone between 2018 and October 7th that for me, before October 7th, showed that there was a shift in Hamas, nowhere near, I didn't anticipate anything like this, but that had indicated to me that there was a shift in Hamas was 2021, which is when Hamas for the first time fired rockets on Jerusalem in response to or in support of the Unity Intifada in response to Israeli settlers trying to dispossess Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah and in East Jerusalem. And that was the first time that Hamas had mobilized in that way, using force, at least in the past 16 years of the blockade, beyond using missile fire specifically to negotiate an easing of the restrictions of the blockade, but rather to mobilize in defense of Palestinians, in this case, specifically in Jerusalem. So this was, I think, a bit of an arm stretch for like a sort of a flexing for Hamas, I think, and indicated that the movement was on a different trajectory.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so it wasn't the state of Israel that instituted the mandate, and it wasn't the state of Israel that partitioned Palestine, or what is, I guess, now Israel. So if it was, as you say, anti-colonial violence, was a Hebrew-speaking, a Hebrew people, Semitic-speaking language, nation of people that is also majority, or at least a significant proportion, Mizrahi Jews who have come from the Middle East, was that really the nation that should be the subject of anti-colonial violence? And how much of this, the language of anti-colonialism and settler colonialism, which is very academic language, how much of that is being impressed upon a population that might be inaccessible, not because they can't understand it, but just because it's very academic language and it's not accessible to everyone, especially in a place like Gaza?
So I'd say two things. So it's not the state of Israel that partitioned Palestine because it didn't exist. What partitioned Palestine was a British Empire. And it partitioned Palestine in order to enable the Zionist movement to create a homeland for Jews in Palestine. And in that sense, the Zionist movement is a colonial movement. The Zionist movement is the movement against which Palestinians are fighting. That's what's the colonial machinery, that Jews from Europe have a right to come and settle in Palestine and in doing so dispossess the indigenous inhabitants of the land. So when we say anti-colonial, that's the colonialism we're talking about. And it was a colonialism that was ushered in by the great powers. So it was ushered in by the British Empire, and then obviously by the US as the imperial power of the time. And again, when we talk about colonialism, maybe it's academic language to Israelis, maybe it's academic language to you. Palestinians talk about istimar and istitan, which are settlement and colonization, every single day. If you go to a Palestinian in Gaza and you tell me about what Israel is, and they would say mustamara, it's a settlement. They've settled our land. This is how colloquially we speak. So maybe Palestinians are just more intellectually developed. I don't know. But this is the language that talks about how Palestinians talk about resisting Israelis. They talk about settlement building and colonization.
But I guess the question was, to what extent is that being impressed from above? Or is it coming from?
This is people on the street. This is people in the street talk about settlers and settlements and colonial powers. This is how Palestinians speak colloquially in the street, not academically.
This is how most formerly colonized people speak still to this day, right? Not just in Palestine.
Yeah.
So look, we're past 1:30. We've organized this lecture series to expand the conversation around Gaza, to challenge conventional interpretations and norms as it's unfolding since October the 7th. Tareq, I think you've certainly managed to accomplish that here today with your presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.